Picture this. Apple owns part of Microsoft. Microsoft owns part of Apple. They both own parts of Google, which owns parts of them. And behind all of them sit the same handful of investment firms, owning everything while being owned by the very companies they control. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is the reality of modern capitalism, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Today's stock market has become a giant circular ownership scheme, where nobody really owns anything. Yet everybody owns everything. And the terrifying part, the people making the decisions about your job, your savings, and your economic future might not even be people at all. Let's start with a number that should terrify you. 3 companies, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street collectively manage over $22 trillion. That's more than the entire GDP of the United States. These 3 firms are the largest shareholders in 88% of the S&P 500. They read the biggest shareholders in Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Facebook, Tesla, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Coca-Cola, Disney, Netflix, and basically every major corporation you can name. But here's where it gets weird. These companies don't actually own these shares. They manage them. The shares belong to millions of regular people through their 401ks, pension funds, and index funds. So technically, you might own a piece of Apple, but you don't get to vote at Apple's shareholder meetings. BlackRock does. You don't get to decide who sits on Apple's board. Vanguard does. You own it, but you have zero control. It's like owning a car, but someone else has the keys, decides where to drive, and you're locked in the trunk. This system didn't exist 50 years ago. In 1950, individual investors owned 90% of American stocks directly. They got voting rights. They made decisions. They had actual ownership. Today, individual direct ownership has collapsed to just 30%. The rest is owned by institutions, and increasingly, by index funds. Index funds were supposed to democratize investing. Instead of trying to pick winning stocks, you could own a tiny piece of everything. Jack Bogle created the first index fund at Vanguard in 1976, and he thought he was helping the little guy. And in many ways, he did. Index funds have low fees. They're diversified. They're simple. But Bogle himself, before he died, warned that his creation had become a monster. He said index funds would create a catastrophic concentration of corporate ownership. He was right. Here's how the circular ownership actually works. BlackRock owns 7% of Apple, but Apple's biggest shareholders after BlackRock are Vanguard at 8% and State Street at 4%. So these 3 firms collectively own nearly 20% of Apple, but Apple itself owns shares in BlackRock through its corporate investment portfolio. Meanwhile, BlackRock owns shares in Vanguard's parent company structure, and both own shares in State Street. State Street owns shares in funds that hold BlackRock and Vanguard products. It's a complete circle. Now multiply this by every major company. Exxon's biggest shareholders are BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. So are Chevron's. These supposed competitors have the exact same major owners. Pepsi and Coca-Cola, supposedly fierce rivals. Same biggest shareholders. Ford and GM. Same shareholders. Every major airline. Same shareholders. Every major pharmaceutical company. Same shareholders. Every major media company. You guessed it. This creates a system economists call common ownership, and it breaks everything we thought we knew about capitalism. Competition is supposed to drive innovation, lower prices, and benefit consumers. But why would BlackRock want Apple and Samsung to compete aggressively when it owns both? Why would Vanguard want United Airlines to undercut American Airlines when it's the biggest shareholder in both? A study by Jose Azar found that airline prices are 10% higher on routes where the same investors own multiple airlines. Another study found that common ownership in banking leads to higher fees and lower deposit rates. When the same people own all the competitors, is there really competition? But wait, defenders say, BlackRock and Vanguard don't actually make decisions. They use something called passive investing. They just track indexes. They claim they don't actively manage. This is technically true and completely meaningless. They still vote on shareholder proposals. They still decide board members. Larry Fink, BlackRock's CEO, writes an annual letter that CEOs treat like holy scripture. When he said companies should focus on climate change, suddenly every CEO became an environmentalist. When he said companies should focus on stakeholder capitalism, suddenly every company started talking about stakeholders. One man, running a company that technically owns nothing but controls everything, effectively sets policy for the entire corporate world. The voting power is the real control mechanism. When you buy an index fund, you typically give up your voting rights to the fund manager. BlackRock votes on behalf of $13 trillion worth of shares. Do you know how BlackRock decides to vote? They use a system called Aladdin, an AI that processes information on over 30,000 investment portfolios. An algorithm is literally voting on corporate decisions that affect millions of jobs and trillions in economic activity. Vanguard and State Street have similar systems. We've outsourced corporate governance to machines owned by companies that are owned by the companies they govern. The concentration is accelerating. Every year, more money flows from active funds to passive index funds. The big three now control over 20% of the average S&P 500 company, up from just 5% in 1998. If current trends continue, they'll control 40% by 2040. At that point, 12 people, the boards of these three companies, will effectively control the entire economy. 12 people most Americans couldn't name if their lives depended on it. And their lives might actually depend on it. Because these firms also own the pharmaceutical companies, the food companies, the defense contractors, and the hospitals. The conflicts of interest are mind-bending. BlackRock owns shares in fossil fuel companies, while also managing ESG funds that are supposed to divest from fossil fuels. They own shares in Facebook, while also owning shares in companies harmed by Facebook's monopolistic practices. They own private prison companies, while managing funds for universities that claim to oppose private prisons. They literally play every side of every issue, because they own every side of every issue. When a scandal breaks at one company, the investors who are supposed to hold them accountable also own the companies that benefit from that scandal. This isn't just about corporate control, it's about political control. The big three have revolving doors with government. Brian Dees went from BlackRock to Biden's National Economic Council. Craig Phillips went from BlackRock to Trump's Treasury Department. The Federal Reserve consults BlackRock for advice, while BlackRock owns shares in the banks the Fed regulates. During COVID, the Fed hired BlackRock to manage its corporate bond buying program. BlackRock was buying bonds of companies it already owned shares.